everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unscripted and Unchoreographed. I'm your host Niamh, the actor, and I have my co-host Sarah, the dancer, and today we're very excited to have the wonderful artist Susie Lamb. How are you doing, Susie?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So as usual, how did you get into the arts?
Well, I was born into a family that were all artists. They went back a few generations. So my great-grandfather was a writer, and actually my great-grandmother, she's a lesser-known writer, but she was also a writer. And then my grandfather was a painter, and my parents were actors. Well, my mother is still an actor. My father, who's passed away, was an actor. My brothers and sister are artists as well. It was just there growing up. I knew lots of people who weren't artists as well, but it was very much in the fabric of how I grew up. And I would have spent time in theatres a lot as a child, often with my dad. We went to the theatre all the time. It was just what we did. But it was kind of not boring. It was just part of life. It wasn't particularly glamorous or anything. It seemed like a very normal thing. I definitely had an interest in writing from a very young age, like from kind of 9 or 10. I remember trying to write my first play when I was 10 and kind of going, God, why can't I write plays like the ones I see in the Abbey? Even at that age, I was kind of struggling with the form of writing or, trying to figure out where I fit in. But in terms of acting, I put that off for quite a long time, considering the family that I came from. And I didn't start acting until I was 23. I didn't go into it when I was a child because I was very shy. I was kind of trying to avoid it and push back from it, even though nobody was forcing me or really even encouraging me that much. So I got into that a bit later. That felt like nearly like a just surrendering to some kind of fate. It's like, okay, I'll do this. I fell into it I went travelling. I was doing a degree in Galway. I was studying English and archaeology, and I went to Budapest for a year on a kind of a gap year. And I actually started acting in Budapest with a company that did Irish plays. My first play was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, School for Scandal. Once I did that, it was like, okay, it wasn't even, oh, I love this so much and I want to do it. It was just like, it just made sense. It just fit. That was the beginning of it. And then there was an evolution. Then I got into dance and more multidisciplinary work. And I was thinking about it recently in terms of writing. Like, writing has been a constant presence, not necessarily professionally. I would probably be known more as an actor. That's kind of my job, if you like. And I go for auditions and I'm out there in that way as an actor. Not quite the same as a writer. I mean, they're different professions anyway. They have different energies and styles. And, writing is often more reflective and kind of quiet, or writers aren't always out there in the same way that a performer might be, or is visible in a certain way. Obviously a bit of a generalization, but in my experience, I suppose. So the writing, I tried to write a novel when I was 17, and I went off and I was like, okay, I'm going to write a novel. And then I fell in love and had a bit of a drama, and I didn't finish my novel. Then when I was 29, I tried to write another novel, and again, I didn't finish it. And then I've just finished, I have actually finished a novel. My writing process has changed, and I suppose, sometimes it's responsive. So it might be responding to a call that's there, or a need, or a submission, and I might create something for that. Over time, my writing went more into performance. So I've written for performance as well. I've also written poetry, and I've had some of that published, and I've had some prose published. It's evolved. I suppose I've just become a little bit stronger in my confidence as a writer, and I suppose that's probably the most significant evolution for me.
The arts was so a part of your upbringing and your family. What age were you when you saw your first play, and what was it?
I would say I probably saw my first play when I was about 6 or 7. We used to get brought to the Abbey, at night, and back then you could buy sweets and you could bring them in. And you could open them very noisily. They had these kind of bumper boxes of fruit pastilles. So that was probably one of the most exciting things for me about the theatre, was that I got sweets, because we didn't get them usually. We were brought to grown-up plays in the Abbey, whatever was going on. I remember seeing Waiting for Godot in Irish. I also saw a lot of plays in the Peacock, because my father was an Irish speaker, and I'm also an Irish speaker. We were raised speaking Irish, being educated through Irish. So I saw a lot of very unusual kind of experimental work through Irish that was in the Peacock at the time. But a very early memory I have in the theatre is watching a rehearsal. So I think I was sick or something. For some reason I was off school, and my dad brought me into the theatre. And I remember sitting in the auditorium, and the play was called The $1 Million Boys. The actors were repeating the scene, and I was really fascinated by this repetition, why they kept doing the same thing over and over again. My dad hadn't explained to me, this is a rehearsal and this is what people do, but I remember being really fascinated by that, and watching the kind of small changes that would happen during whatever the director would say to them, and between each scene. And that felt like a very significant moment for me, somehow, in the sense of the craft of theatre and the work that goes into it. And that really stayed with me, and the kind of boringness of it. And when I say boringness, I don't mean to put it down. I mean the kind of repetition and the meticulous, just going over it and kind of plodding through, and you're not quite sure how it's going to turn out. Maybe you don't think you're doing a great job, but you just kind of put one foot in front of the other and keep going. And plus the physicality of what was going on stage, because they kept rehearsing a scene change where they moved the furniture, and I was just like really, really fascinated by that, the physicality, the kind of dance of it all. So that's probably one of my earliest memories, the sweets, and then that rehearsal session.
And do you have a favourite play or performance that you've seen?
Well, I do love Marina Carr, her work. It's just incredible to me. And By the Bog of Cats, I remember seeing that years ago. Loved that. I do sometimes like seeing work that I don't fully think is perfect, where someone is trying to do something and it's maybe a little bit brave or experimental, but maybe they don't quite get there, or they're trying to figure it out. I'm also very interested in that on stage, and I think it's one of the reasons I think it's a pity that there's not as much theatre happening as there could be, because to see stuff you don't like, to see stuff that isn't perfect, I think that's one of the fallouts of the situation that we're in at the moment in terms of funding and making work. Is that just the variety of work. I do remember when I was in Dublin, when I left drama school, there was, plays were just put on. They were cheaper to put on. It was a totally different mechanism of making work. And there was a lot of stuff to go and see. And I'm not saying that isn't there now. I know there's lots of great initiatives, but I think there could always be more. That people are just trying stuff out, and it's exciting, and there's something alive about it as well. So I went to the Gaiety School of Acting, and I graduated in 2000. So I'm coming up on 25 years now out of drama school. We had core acting classes. We had core voice classes. We also had text, how to handle text, the different mechanisms of different kinds of texts, like Shakespeare, phrasing, meter, that kind of thing. So the kind of mechanics, we would one class of that a week, say. We also did improvisation, we did stage combat. Some of these classes we had every day, some we had in blocks. But the core classes were acting and voice. For me, voice training was really, really important. Because it isn't just about making sure you don't lose your voice or being able to project. It's so much more than that. It's about how do you convey emotion through your voice? How do you take on different characters with your voice, tone and texture? And I was very lucky to have a very good voice teacher called Cathal Quinn, who's now teaching in the Lear. It was probably the most interesting to me. I am particularly fascinated with voice work, singing, voiceover. I do quite a lot of audio work as well. But yeah, that was a very slow and steady study of voice and one's use of voice. And a very personal thing as well, because obviously our voices are so personal to us. Like, I came out of drama school and I was just so ready to work. I was like, come on, okay, give me the jobs. And then I started auditioning. And then I was like, oh my God, this is really scary. And that was a whole process in itself. But I'm very glad to have had that experience of going into audition rooms and meeting directors. It's a really valuable experience. Certainly for me it was, because, you have to keep your nerve and do what they're asking you to do and respond. And they're sitting there looking at you. And some of them don't look so friendly. It's a difficult situation, but a really good training. But the real training, I suppose, then started when I actually got my first job and I had to put everything into practice. So I had to repeat the performance, or, back then there were a lot of quite long tours. So the way the funding worked, so I did quite a lot of tours. Like sometimes I did shows that might have gone on for 8 or 9 weeks, and you'd be traveling around, which was also a really, really valuable experience. So I suppose for me, drama school was kind of the first step in the training, the experience of being allowed to fail, being able to figure out what kind of actor I was, and also the peer feedback. My fellow students really helped me to kind of understand what my strengths, my natural strengths were, and then the areas that I needed to, maybe didn't come so easily to me. But that's an ongoing thing, getting feedback from peers and from the work itself, because as an actor, or as a performer, it's not a static thing. It's never complete in my experience. You keep evolving and changing and developing. And then as your body changes, you're dealing with a different instrument, because obviously I'm not going to get cast as a 25-year-old, whatever. I'm constantly in relationship with that as I go along. How are people seeing me? How do I feel about that? Do I agree? Do I not agree? Do I want to push against that and say, no, I can still play these roles, or I can not still play, but I can play these kinds of roles? But I enjoy that because it keeps me interested. It's not a fixed project and that's it. It's all done and dusted. But I would definitely recommend drama school. I mean, the right drama school. They can be expensive, but I think for me, the kind of craft gives a safety. I can always kind of fall back on the craft, my tools, if you like. It's like my set of tools. And if I get confused or I'm not sure where to go, I can come back to something. And it gives a kind of a groundedness for me and can keep things simple in a rehearsal room, for example. I suppose I became interested in multidisciplinary work. I mean, partly it was a reaction, I suppose, to the feeling that, why with all these plays is everyone kind of like standing up and talking? The dominance of those kind of heavy narrative, or a particular kind of narrative where people are talking, standing there talking. And I don't mean to undermine at all the skill of standing there talking. I don't mean that at all. These people are absolutely brilliant at what they do, and I've a lot of respect for that as well. But it was just, is there something else? I think, but I think more than that, it was the visual aspect of what multidisciplinary work can do. Narrative is not so closely linked to what people are saying. It's also what people are doing physically, or image, or a mixture of those things, and how those things relate to each other, the dialogue between those things. But also it was I suppose a personal journey or a personal investigation. I realized, I think after working for about 6-7 years, that so I was, working in different theatres around and on TV and stuff, that I felt I'd only scratched the surface in terms of some of my training, particularly the voice training. So I wanted to explore things more deeply, like the physical aspect of voice more deeply, and my physical presence on stage. I also still felt a little bit kind of uncomfortable on stage sometimes, not 100% physically present. I started to look more deeply into different physical practices and so on. Then I just kind of followed my nose. It was also like working with dance was a way of just opening up a physical vocabulary and broadening my expression as a performer. But a lot of it was the visual aspect that I found there was so much storytelling and so much that could be transmitted in a non-narrative way. That's not to say that dance can't be narrative. I don't mean that either. And there's another kind of narrative happening. But I mean the strict narrative way that I was kind of used to observing. And then I suppose also what happened was I had a child. I needed to earn money. I had done some dance training, and then I went on to do a master's because I was hoping to get work in third level institutions, and I knew that I would need a master's at the very least to do that. It was a case of, okay, I was being quite strategic. Dance seemed to be something that I could teach quite easily in the area where I live. I work between Dublin and Kilkenny. There seemed to be a need for dance work. And I worked for 16 years in a place called KCAT in Kilkenny, and I developed a lot of dance work there alongside the theatre department, and that was really exciting. But it was a combination of practicality in terms of, okay, I need something more regular, and I took a little step back from theatre. Not that I took a step back; I was still doing it, but from being 100% freelance, because I needed to get some regular dough on the table.
Where did you do your masters, or was your masters in dance? Was your child quite young when you were doing the masters? How did you balance that?
It was a 2-year master's. It was in the University of Limerick. So I'd been teaching dance. I'd been working from when she was about 2 till when she was about 7. This is on a part-time basis. And then I decided to do a master's when she was about 7 or 8, and that was in the University of Limerick, and it was in dance, but it had a practice-based element. So my second year was actually a study on the integration of vocal and movement techniques. So that was what my research was, and that's really my nerdy obsession, which I won't get into now because I literally will talk forever. But, the dialogue between voice and movement. And it comes back a little bit to what I was saying with drama school, where I felt that, and it's not to criticize the training that was offered, it's also what I was able for at the time. But I felt that it was not as embodied as it could have been, very, very technical. So I wanted to look further into that and see, can dance enrich vocal work and vice versa? So that's what my thesis was in, and I did a practice-based element of that in relation to a performance that I made. Yeah, so my daughter was 10 when I finished that.
Could give advice to your younger self?
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends a little bit on what art form somebody wants to go into, or what combination of art forms. I suppose, the landscape is very different now for people starting than it was when I started. And in many ways, I think there are different challenges now. And one of the things is financial. I don't mean that it's harder now, but there are different things to consider. So when I started, not everybody was expected to earn their living from the arts. It was known that people often did other things, and that wasn't a shameful thing. But there were lots of other kinds of work that could be done to support the arts work. I don't know, was it better paid or the cost of living was less? But I mean, I had jobs. I don't know how I lived really, because I worked as a waitress. And I had a great life. Now it was just me and so on. But I rented a good place. I had access to space. Rehearsal rooms were cheap or possibly free and so on. Yeah, so there are different considerations now. But I think finding one's truth around the financial is really important. Find out what works for you in terms of your energy. Are you going to be able to sustain it? Because one of the unfortunate things, I think, is that people drop off. It can often happen. I know a lot of people, when they had a family, they just couldn't do it anymore because of some of the conditions that they had to work in, and it just wasn't possible. Or people get burnt out. It's really important when you're starting to go, well, what works for me? What is the balance of things that works for me? Is it that I work, in a shop 2 days a week, and that gives me a certain peace of mind, which allows me to do my other work? Or am I just going to get social welfare and so on? Like, how does it work? And to really be kind of true to oneself, it's just as important, I think. The other thing I would say is, find people who like your work or who get your work, and talk to them. Keep communicating with people, even if it's just a coffee or a chat. Particularly in the performing arts, the community is so important, and it is a collaborative art form. Find your people. If they're not there in front of you, but you think you might know somebody down the road and you like the look, just give them a ring. And don't be afraid to give people a ring. Don't be afraid to get in touch with people. Even if they're much further along than you, people are often really helpful and happy to speak. Another thing I suppose I would say, and I mean, I say this to myself, and I'm saying all of this to myself, it's a constant conversation in terms of balance and sustainability, is just because your work might not fit in with the trends, it doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. There is that balance between when you're applying for funding, trying to, I think we all know that things go in trends and that certain things will not be funded and certain things will. And it could be to do with an element that's in the work. And I think those of us who go through those channels understand that. But I think it's really important to not expect everything to fit a trend or to keep a certain space of your work where you just do what the hell you want. To keep a sense of freedom around it and aliveness. Because I think the work can be detrimentally affected if you're always looking to fit into something. And in its nature, artistic work is rebellious. That's something I tell myself, that's something I would advise younger people, and that's something I'd love to see more. People following their noses, what really, excites them. One thing I think is important is intergenerational work as well, where a more natural coexistence or co-creation between people of different generations and different experience. Because I think people can learn from each other. And I don't mean that young people can learn from old people. I don't mean it in that kind of way, but just a more organic collective, if you like. That's something that I'm interested in because I think people do drop off or don't continue. I think it's a pity that some people are still not around to be in the conversation. So that's something I'm curious about, I suppose. It's not that I'm saying, we have to do it this way, but it's something I'm curious about. I remember when I lived in Connemara, you'd go to like a party and there were just people from, you'd have the granny and the great granny and the kids. And there was a kind of a richness in that. Young people or people starting, let's use that instead of saying young people, but people starting. Another piece of advice I would say is, it's not to always look to the cities, like that there are interesting things happening outside the cities. I'm from Dublin and I moved to very rural areas. Where I am now isn't that rural. It's a completely different way of making work. The people around you are different. You might not have access to the same kinds of people or the same people working in your area, but you may have much more space, for example. The funding streams are different. And it is something I'd like to see change in funding around how rural areas are addressed or areas outside the bigger cities. And I think it's a conversation a lot of people are particularly now with the move to rural areas, because people can buy houses potentially that they couldn't buy in bigger cities. For people starting, don't rule that out. In terms of sustainability, some of these ways of working are more supportive or might be more supportive to someone and just to a better life, a better quality of life, more fresh air, not so crowded. Keep you an open mind, I suppose.
If there are any programs or mentorships or funding that you'd like to see more of in Ireland, or maybe in Budapest, you would have seen different funding or programs that would be beneficial here.
It's just a huge question, and not to not answer, but I think the only way I can kind of answer it without sitting down with a big graph, what I'd like to see is more joined up thinking in terms of funding and in terms of the lives of artists. And we've started to have those conversations with like the basic income for artists pilot scheme. I mean, that is an absolute no-brainer to me. I think that should be rolled out. And it's not just because it would make my life easier, but I've seen the benefits that I can bring to other people when I'm on a steady wage, where I can read somebody's play. I can say, yeah, cool. I can be much more free with my time, much more organic. There's more output, actually. So not just for those reasons, not just about myself, but just as a kind of an ecosystem. But also things like education. And it goes back to what I was saying a while ago, where I was saying that when I started out, there were jobs that you could do that seemed to support your life. And one of those things was teaching. there were some really good teaching jobs, and you could actually get permanent contracts, permanent part-time contracts, and you could, so in other words, you could get your pension. This is something I'm thinking about now. How the hell do I get this pension thing that people are talking about? So in order to keep going and to keep working as an artist, so for example, there's a new Leaving Cert subject coming in, supposedly drama, theatre and film, and I think, wouldn't it be incredible if we had a whole load of practitioners teaching those, like brilliant people who understand the soft skills and who understand the practical skills, and not having people who maybe don't want to teach it so much being shoehorned into it. But that kind of joined up thinking, like where the government can get on board with a kind of an overall system. So it's not the responsibility of the Arts Council to address every single problem, if that makes sense. That's my hope. That's what I would like to see, is more joined up thinking and less admin. How do we get the money to the artist in the most direct way? How does that happen? Because I think many people are admin fatigued. And plus it's giving someone a job to do a whole load of paperwork when possibly that salary could, fund 3 people for a year, or I don't know. And again, it's not to undermine the admins. There are some fantastic people doing this work, and I don't think anybody likes admin really, but it's got too top heavy in that regard. So how do you get the money quickly to the artist? How does that happen? And that could be in a really grassroots way. Another thing is free travel. I think that would be a good initiative. Off-peak free travel times. I live in Kilkenny, so if I'm coming up for arts festivals or I'm going to Dublin for auditions, that's all cost. And then that would take certain spending out of the Arts Council as well, because the travel costs might not be as high. I don't know. But free travel, the basic income for the artists, less admin, more joined up thinking.
I think that is an excellent proposal, and thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thanks a million.